coming out tonight. But we're very happy to have Kirk here tonight with us. Also, I want to acknowledge our friend and volunteer Jerry Lang on the camera. This is his last taping of an event, and he goes all around the Finger Lakes and tapes lectures for all different historical societies, including our museum, and then he produces a DVD with the event so people who can attend can watch it later. So I'd just like to give a round of applause to Jerry. Thank you very much, Jerry. We have all our previous lectures on DVD if you'd like to borrow them.
Wait until you get the bill.
Well, anyways, like I said, we're very pleased to have Kirk House here tonight to talk about our boats, something that I don't really know anything about, and I don't think Ed and many of the boat guys here really know too much about. So we're very pleased that Kirk has come down from Bath. As most of you know, he's the director of the Steuben County Historical Society and a great local historian, and we listen to him on the radio every day about what's going on or what did go on. So very pretty cool stuff. Anyways, Kirk House.
Thanks, everybody, and thank you for having me back. I was glad when Griffin called me and asked me to, or emailed me, whichever, and asked me to speak to you on this topic. I create some research topics myself, and then others come from requests. A few years ago, town of Wayne asked me to write a history of their highway system so that they could use that in some of their decision making. And then other people asked me to speak on particular topics. A few years ago, I was asked to speak on the history of the county poorhouse. And I said, really? You want to talk on the poorhouse and you want me to do it? All right, I'll do that, I guess. It turned out to be very interesting research, but it's not a topic that would have sprung to my mind. But here we are. And this really is a very significant aspect of our history. In fact, in a lot of ways, our history got started because of this. They were planning to do this when the white people started moving in here. But it was over so long ago that we don't know a lot about it. So let's get on to it. We really don't know the details on this photo here. But since photography didn't get to Steuben County before the 1850s, then this was already a dinosaur by that time. And who knows, it might have been much later, even decades after that, somebody could have been doing it. But it really was way back. So to look at the setting first, kind of how we got here. According to Spafford's 1824 Gazetteer of New York State, Steuben County is abundantly watered by navigable branches of the Tioga or Shimon River, a large western branch of the Susquehanna, and by their numerous small tributaries. And he notes that the Conhockton, the Tioga, and the Canisteo are all boatable. And that made a lot of difference to the people at this stage of the game. He points out that the Conhockton is boatable up as far as the village of Bath, where it is 75 feet wide. And that the Canisteo rises 6 or 8 feet in spring and fall, when, he says, arcs of 30 tons navigate it in safety as far up as the western line of Hornellsville, what we call Arkport nowadays. And by the way, he also says that the Canisteo abounds in fish, including ocean-going shad. A great extent of the country depends on this navigation, he reports. And because of these connections, Arkport sends wheat to Baltimore, where it sells at 25 cents a bushel, and potash to New York City, where it fetches $13 a ton. And he goes on to say that the Tioga or Shimon is navigable for the whole of its route in New York State. And he says boats of 10 tons navigate the Susquehanna and rafts descend it in time of freshets, spring and fall. Now, why 10-ton boats on the Susquehanna and 30-ton boats on the Canisteo? I would say that's a typo or a slip-up someplace along the way. But then he also notes 9 streams in Steuben County, most of them with Indian names, that are of some use for navigation, as he puts it. And he goes on to say that in Painted Post, there are some fine groves of locust timber, very valuable to shipbuilding, considerable quantities of which descend the streams to Baltimore and the market. And taking a very long view, he adds that the upland plains of Steuben County present a pleasing contrast to the agriculturalist when compared with the gloomy dell that skirts his fields, through which wind the streams that convey his surplus products to market. So to him, the river and its fringes was almost a waste. The only thing it was good for was that that's where you shipped the stuff that you grew someplace else. And this is in 1824, which is 1 year before the Erie Canal opened. Certainly stretches of it were open, but as a whole it was not yet open. And he notes that a canal is contemplated to connect the Conhattan River with Crooked Lake, and from there to the yet unfinished Erie Canal. Now, of course, that canal never came to be. And for what it's worth, my opinion, speculation, whatever, is that they never used the term Crooked Lake. I think it was Crooked Lake, because if you look at it, it's not crooked, but it is crooked. It's shaped like a crook. So I think that's actually what they called it. But that's the setting and the background, so now we get into the arcs themselves. If I can turn the page, we will anyway. Okay. And let's take a quick look at the next frame, if we could, which is just the same photo differently produced in our grayscale that we're used to rather than the sepia. The sepia looks weird to us, but actually it's just as realistic as the grayscale is. And if you've ever seen cyan, where they all come out blue, that looks weird, but it isn't any weirder than grayscale. It's just what we're used to. And the next picture, please. This is John Mcmaster, who wrote the first substantial history of Steuben County and published it in 1853. So he was a contemporary, or at least overlapped, with a lot of the people from this early arcing era. Also, there are other histories of Steuben County, many more pages, but all of them, whenever possible, just copy out as much of McMaster's book as they can get away with. So we really do depend on him a lot. It's also kind of unfortunate that 3 of our important early sources are McCall, McClure, and McMaster. So I have trouble keeping them straight, and I'm not even sure I got every name down right, because sometimes I type one when I'm thinking the other. But let's see here. Frederick Bartels, or Friedrich Bartels, if you prefer, built the first ark. Also, George McClure built the first ark, Benjamin Patterson built the first ark, Charles Williamson built the first ark, and Christopher Hurlbut built the first ark. You can get all of those reports if you look into it. Now, part of the confusion lies with who paid for the building and who actually wielded the hammer and did the building. But if we get the next picture, please. This is kind of the father of our area, Charles Williamson. And McMaster reports that Charles Williamson commissioned a study on clearing the rivers so as to make them navigable by arcs of 75 by 16 feet. Now, with no reason whatsoever, I kind of had it in my head that these arcs would be something like a Durham boat. But when I looked at these figures, I realized this is substantially bigger than that. This is more like canal boat, full canal boat size kind of thing. According to McCall, this species of craft was the invention of a Mr. Kreider, who in 1792 built one on the Juniata, loaded it with wheat and whiskey, and ran it down the Susquehanna to Baltimore. And George McClure built, I think we can say pretty confidently, the first ark. And he made the first experimental voyage laden with lumber, staves, and wooden pipe. And lumber, of course, was the great early product of our region. It was free for the taking, assuming you had rights to the land, or even if you didn't sometimes. You could transport it by river, and you needed to clear the land anyway before you could produce anything else. It took McClure a half hour to get 5 miles from Bath. Pretty good. There they grounded, and it took about 6 days to get from there to Painted Post, where they waited another 4 or 5 days for the river to rise. We made a fresh start, and in 4 days ran 200 miles. So sometimes you're running 50 miles a day, and sometimes you were stalled for a week. He was aiming for Baltimore, got grounded near Harrisburg, negotiated a decent deal for his cargo there, because he had established that the thing could be done. It was an experiment to see whether it could be done. He really didn't need to go on further in order to accomplish what he and Williamson had set out to do. Now, Charles came back here. George came back here. He and his brother Charles went into business in Bath and Dansville. Took in 4,000 bushels of wheat and 200 barrels of pork. He built 4 arks at Arkport, and these were said to be the first ones to navigate the Geneseo, and ran all the way down to Baltimore with them. One winter he built 8 arks at Bath and 4 on the Geneseo, shipping flour to Baltimore and wheat to Columbia, Pennsylvania. The river was in fine order, and he made a prosperous voyage and a profitable sail. His next project was to build a schooner on Crooked Lake of about 30 tons burden. This was the Sally, and it was important for shipping in the early days of Crooked Lake, however you want to put it. He also bought fur, pelts, and deer hams, shipping them downriver. One year he boarded 40 head of the best and largest cattle onto arks, which must have been an experience, and shipped them to Columbia, then drove them overland from Columbia to Philadelphia, where they sold to good advantage. Now, Anson McCall reports before the white settlement, the rivers were much deeper, stronger, and steadier than they are at the present day. The destruction of the forests has caused the drying up of multitudes of little springs. Then the snow melting in the woods slowly caused the March and April floods to be deliberate and of long continuance. Now the snow falling upon bare hills and open farms melts rapidly at sunshine and shower. The state geologist apprehends serious inconvenience from the failure of water if the destruction of the forests is continued in the future as extravagantly as during the last 50 years. And of course, it also led to a century or more of disastrous floods. So it's very interesting, in the middle of the 19th century, well, first of all, we had a state geologist back then, who knew? But already people were recognizing the environmental degradation that was going on and the disastrous results that we were storing up. And already, of course, people weren't doing anything about it. In the 1790s, the rivers were jammed with floodwood. And one of the authors of the day said, "It is one of the most pleasing results of a judicious civilization that these tangled torrents have been combed out so smoothly." Now, Swing and Patterson, working on behalf of Williamson, built an ark 80 foot by 20 foot, 5 miles below Bath, and they set out on March 14th, 1800. And if we can get the next photo here, we have no photo of Benjamin, no image of Benjamin Patterson. We don't know what he looked like at all, but we do know that he has a sideways grave over in the Irwin Townsend Cemetery. We are also not 100% sure that's just where he's buried, because it's been flooded so many times and the stones have gone flying so many times that people have just kind of taken a guess. So Swing and Patterson set out March 14th, 1800. Even so, Frederick Bartles of what's now Bradford was noted by the county clerk in the 1800 records of deeds as being the first to utilize this as his hoped useful invention, even though the clerk acknowledged in the same note that somebody had gone before him. So why say he was first, except that he wasn't? I don't get that at all. And actually, he was he wasn't even first that year, let alone first at all, because McClure had already made that trip down to Harrisburg. He was the first to do it from Bradford. On April 4th, he sent out 2 arcs from the outlet of Mud Lake, which is their name for Lamoka Lake. So the mill pond on Lamoka Lake, that's all Mud Lake to them. 1 arc built by Colonel Williamson, 72 foot by 15. The other by Nathan Harvey, 71 foot by 15. They made their way down Mud Creek and thence to Baltimore, thus initiating the trade. And of course, Mud Creek runs from the mill pond down to Savona. So it goes through the, well, it's all forest there basically nowadays. When he needed water, he opened the gate at the mill pond. He had that advantage. He had already built a dam there, and so he could produce water when he wanted to. Thus, it was ascertained to a certainty that by improving those streams, we could transport our produce to Baltimore, a distance of 300 miles in the spring of the year for a mere trifle. And it was said rafting and ark building now became a lively business upon all the streams in the springtime. Bath was now boomed all over the country. Could we see the next map, please? Now, this map gives us a picture of what they were up to. And I don't think I'm really telling you guys anything you don't know, but let's take a look at it. So here we are here, the Conhockton River, and here we've got the Susquehanna. This part of it is the Shimon. Conhockton flows into the Shimon. Here's the Geneseo River. Going down here, we'll get to Prattsburg and then to the Ohio River. And of course, the Mohawk up here. Now, part of their thinking was that you could ship up the Geneseo, but you got falls like at Wadsworth, for instance. It's not very convenient. Plus, you're going out to a foreign country, plus it's frozen up there much of the time. You could ship down the Ohio, but man, if you're trying to reach the eastern markets, that's really the long way around. You could go to the Mohawk, but that involves a lengthy overland journey to get there. So they figured the Conhockton, the Geneseo, Shimon into the Susquehanna, that this was going to be the great center of trade. And they were envisioning Eskimos and everybody bringing their stuff down here and trading out from there. Well, it didn't quite work out like that for them, obviously. But if we see the next picture, please. This map shows the direction of commerce in the arcing days. So here's Bath, and here's Arkport. And traffic on Keuka Lake ran south primarily in those days, down to what we call Hammondsport, then down the Vale of Pleasant Valley to Bath to be transshipped from there. Likewise, we can see Mud Creek here. Also, people came overland from the Genesee River in order to get to either Bath or Arkport and ship out from there. So the traffic is running south. And that's the picture of the arcing days. That's how the thing works and how it gets started. Dick Peer reported that 2 men could build an ark in 2 weeks. So that's pretty good, assuming it's correct. But relatively speaking, it was a cheap product. It was not going to meet storms at sea or anything like that. And it was only meant for one use. And it could be done with the kind of skills that a lot of guys had. I have here, rather than try to read this all to you, I'll send these out, and these are double-sided, but if you look at the side that says Centennial of Bath, those are the directions in case you want to build an ark. And that was published in 1893, at a time when this was long since over with, but it's incredible the amount of detail that's there. In 1804, a poet went to Newtown, now Elmira, and he gave a graphic, poetic picture of river navigation during the spring freshet upon the Susquehanna. Here, when soft spring dissolves the wastes of snows, and wide and deep the roaring river flows, huge loaded ox rush down the boiling tide, and winding through wild woods triumphant ride. Hills, towering steeps, and precipices high, rich plains and hanging rocks behind them fly. The watchful pilot every eddy eyes, as down the torrent's foaming course he flies. Views with stern look the frightful falls disclose, and down the outrageous breakers headlong goes. 1,000 toils, 1,000 dangers past, Columbia's harbor shelters them at last. So at this stage of the game in 1804, this was something that was worthy of poetic commemoration. This was something that was very significant, certainly to our area, but to the whole general health of the nation, and especially of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Storehouses went up in Bath, including 3 at the foot of Ark Street. And Ark Street in Bath, just like Ark Port in Hornellsville, commemorates these days. Sleighs crowded into Ark Street from Geneva and the Geneseo. In spring, arks were floated to the storehouses. Grain was poured into them in bulk. I hadn't realized that. They just filled up the hull, the vessel, with bulk grain. And the pilots with their jolly helpers began their returnless journey. About 1 in 10, it said, emptied its contents into the river. When Bath was on the eve of realizing Williamson's expectations, the canals were constructed, and lo, its glory departed. The Ark of the Conhockton passed into history. The rats took possession of the storehouses. The roofs caved in, the beams rotted away, and what was left of them tumbled into ruins. They don't write history like that anymore. Let's see the next picture, please. Here we have Christopher Hurlbut. And Christopher Hurlbut built one of the first arks in Arkport. That's his house, which still stands in Arkport behind him. In 1800, he sent it to Baltimore laden with wheat, with John Stearns of Geneseo as the pilot. He built a storehouse on the east bank of the Geneseo in Arkport, to which farmers came from the Genesee Valley with butter, cheese, wheat, corn, etc., waiting only for the moving of the waters. Thousands of bushels were shipped annually, and as many as 11 arks a year. Hurlbut obtained a passage of an act by the legislature of the state, making the Geneseo River a public highway, and made it a channel of commerce down whose waters were borne much of the products of the Genesee country. If we can see the next photo, this is from our collection at Steuben County Historical Society. It's the blade for the sweep of a river ark. Now, just the steering sweep, yes. I was reading something as I was preparing this, said a lot of these were turned into ironing boards. Well, when we got it, it was an ironing board, covered with fabric. And one day I said to our curator, Ron Wyatt, I said, Ron, the fact that it was an ironing board is the least significant thing about this. So what say we tear off the fabric, junk that, and just exhibit it more directly as the blade of a river sweep. And he agreed, and that's what we did. Joel, I'm sorry, yes?
It's next to a carpet sweeper.
An extra carpet sweeper, yeah. And a Franklin stove on this side, and a poster for Bath Fair on that side. So when you got something like that, which stands about this tall, you're kind of limited in where you can exhibit it. Let's see here. Joel Pratt cleared 110 acres 4 miles west of Pleasant Valley. The next year, he hired men from Bath and Pleasant Valley, the only near settlements, to cut his grain with sickles. And they threshed that winter with flails, then took it to Bath by ox team and sent it to Baltimore in the spring of 1802. Captain Pratt came back from Baltimore on foot with nearly $8,000 in his pocket.
Wow.
Yeah. And we should have specified that, as we said, this is a one-way trip for the ox. So how do you get back once you get to Columbia or Havre de Grace or to Baltimore or wherever you disposed of it? You walk. Wow. You come back on foot from there. Now, he actually didn't have to stop at Baltimore. One guy got, I guess, a fleet of arks down there, checked prices, leased ships, and went to Boston and sold out there. So that was not ordinary. The next one, please. General Wadsworth of Geneseo, William Wadsworth, sent 2 boatloads of very large stall-fed oxen from Arkport to Baltimore in 1804. In 1806, Hall and Ellsworth of Geneseo sent down an ark from Arkport laden with 300 barrels of mess pork, a large quantity of cheese, and a great number of dried venison hams. Jonathan Corey went down with this load, and he says that they lived high on the trip. One man came back from his journey without any money, insisting that he had been robbed along the way back. His neighbors, who were expecting their share of the profits, suspected that he had cheated them, and they never trusted him again after that. Ira Davenport, if we can see the next picture, Ira Davenport, the orphanage man, and John Arnott, the next picture of Elmira. At the time of their deaths in the 1860s, they were said to be almost the only survivors of the men who, in the early days, were largely engaged in arking grain. So a lot of the people who were very prominent in the early days were engaged in this trade in one way or another. And the next picture, please. This is Jacob van Volkenberg of Prattsburg. His son, Franklin Butler van Volkenberg, born 1835, reported that his father had formerly bought or raised grain in Prattsburg, then taken it by wagon to a landing on the Conhockton River, and shipped it from thence to Baltimore in arks, which were built in such a way as to serve to carry the grain to that city, and then, as it was impossible to take them up the river, they were taken to pieces and sold in the lumber market. When I remember, however, the market for our grain was on the Erie Canal, which leads us to our next topic, the collapse, and our next photo, too, for that matter. This is Robert Troupe. He was Alexander Hamilton's best friend from Columbia University before the American Revolution. And he's still on the job in 1830, which is kind of fascinating. And in 1830, a lot of the farmers living around this area produced a memorial to him. He was the land agent for the Pulteney estate. And in the very first sentence, they cited as the key to their problems construction of the Erie Canal. They said that was the source of the collapse of land values and agricultural prices, along with the general peace in Europe, the difficulty of clearing land, and the sale of government lands at low prices. And they didn't quite have riots, but they had demonstrations and memorials and petitions and negotiations. And eventually the company, the Pulteney estate, agreed to revalue all the lands. The problem was the land prices had collapsed, and with it the price of their agricultural produce had collapsed. These people now had mortgages that they would never be able to pay off. And so the company eventually, as I said, negotiated a lowering of the final purchase price so people could take it from there. So the Erie Canal was an excellent thing all around, but southern tier, it hit like a neutron bomb. It just wiped things out altogether here. There was like no business, no activity anymore. In 1836, Gordon published a New York Gazetteer, and he says that in freshets, the Conhockton is navigable 14 miles above Bath. Now, maybe, I'm not sure it's navigable with a 75-foot arc. He names 9 smaller streams, which now have mostly Anglo names, most of which are navigable in high water. And he also reports now a proposed railroad from Bath to Urbana. Not a canal anymore, but a railroad. Now, that's pretty far-sighted, considering that at that time, all the railroads in Steuben County was a single track coming up from Pennsylvania going to what's now Corning, through Lindley and like that. And the railroads wouldn't reach Bath until the early 1850s. But it does suggest how rapidly patterns were changing just 11 years after the Erie Canal opened. And of course, the rail connection from Bath to Keuka Lake finally came in 1878. According to French's 1860 Gazetteer of the state, in high water, the Conhockton used to be navigable 14 miles above Bath. And by this time, it was necessary to go during the freshets. A 16-page pamphlet was published in 1841, printed in Addison, the chart or navigator of the Susquehanna River from Tioga Point to Marietta, revised, improved, and extended. Considerable lumber is floated down these rivers and finds a market at Philadelphia and Baltimore. But even at that, lumbering, though still extensive in 1860, is decreasing. So the arcing ended after the Erie Canal opened. However, shipping lumber down continued. You obviously weren't going to haul lumber up to the Erie Canal and then ship it to New York City. But you could continue to drift that downward on the streams. Now, if we look at another picture here, the canals, this is the Shimon feeder canal, and that plus the Crooked Lake Canal now provided an access outward and up to the Erie Canal system. And another picture, we're over in Horseheads area here, and actually we've got connections now down to Athens, Pennsylvania. French describes the two feeder canals, tells us that Crooked Lake is navigated by steam and canal boats. Another picture, please. And Crooked Lake forms a link in the chain of internal improvement that afford ample facilities for the transportation of goods and passengers and bring the farm products of the country to the eastern markets. And he mentions various works, canals and railroads and highways. So the river traffic, indeed inland waterways traffic in general, is still active but is already being eclipsed, which is no surprise considering the railroad is coming on strong. Now if we see the next picture, here we have a look at the traffic as it ran from 1833 to 1851. Now the other picture was 1798 to 1825. I don't have anything in between because there wasn't any traffic. To all intents and purposes, it was pretty dead. But now, the traffic is largely running north on Keuka Lake rather than south. Hammondsport becomes a true port at this time. And people come from a 5-county region of New York and Pennsylvania, bring their goods up here, up Pleasant Valley to Hammondsport, and then ship out through the Crooked Lake Canal, or they come up from Newtown or Elmira and up Seneca Lake and out into the Erie system. So whereas Baltimore and Philadelphia had been the destinations before, now the destination is New York City through the Erie Canal system. But also, you might not have noticed this on the other picture, but all the arrows were pointing one way. Now there are two-way arrows. This overland traffic is pretty much one way, but this waterborne traffic is two-way. So now, because of the canals and the advent of steam too, we're able to get goods in substantial amounts in. Prior to that, it was all about getting the goods out. We're still doing that, obviously, but now we're getting goods in at the same time. And as I looked at this, I realized Charles Williamson's business plan was to settle this area lightly with large estates. He may have been thinking of the fact that you can only bring so much stuff in. And if you had a lot of people, there would be too many people, you wouldn't be able to support and supply them. That might have been what was on his mind. By the way, for somebody else's research, what the heck were they using when they went upriver? Because they were doing that as far back as the 1790s. And I often wonder, is it canoes, keel boats, rowing boats? Well, everything that I find when it's described as a canoe. So I suspect that's the heart of it, but somebody maybe can do that research. What were they doing upriver in the very early days? So while the Erie Canal killed off arcing, rafting of lumber still remained viable. According to Ansel McCall, the Bath Centennial in 1893, Frederick Bartels took 2 rafts of boards from Mud Creek in the spring of 1798. Before they got the arks, they tried the rafts, so we're jumping back in time here, which in a very brief time and at a very small cost were landed safely in Baltimore. This settled the question of navigation for that species of craft. Captain Luther White of Cameron would run as many as 40 rafts a year of 40,000 to 60,000 feet of lumber each. Now if we can see the next picture, Andrew, this is probably what most of us think about when we think about sending lumber downriver and the perils of Pauline and the heroine tied to the log on the sawmill and all that. But if we look at the next picture, this is what we're talking about. We're not just talking about dumping it in and letting it float down. They actually built these rafts, as they called them. And that paper I gave you, if you turn it over, you can find out how to build a raft. So you can build either an ark or a raft. Now, in either case, you're going to need a lot of lumber for the purpose. Franklin van Volkenberg described lumber rafts made just as they are now on the rivers in this state. And he was writing that about 1890. So this was still going on in some places at that time. Using ropes and wooden pins, fasten enough lumber together to build half a dozen small houses. By the way, he says smaller crafts were called Canisteo Colts. And wouldn't that make a great name for a baseball team? The Canisteo Colts. Anyway, you would build the raft in sections. And when going over dams, each section would drop by itself. So when this section goes down, the back section might well go up at the same time. Some sections would then be underwater and some would be above water. So the crew had to race back and forth so as to get no more than knee-deep in water. Their goal was not to stay dry. That was utterly impossible. It was just to stay dry above the knees. And maybe you could do that and maybe you couldn't. As the raft went with great velocity, Franklin wrote, this maneuver had to be completed in short notice and was one of the thrilling episodes of the trip. And he was lucky who escaped a good ducking, not to mention anything worse.
Those rafts had sweeps as well?
Yes, the rafts had sweeps, as you can see in the illustration there, and usually a small hut on it. So these are just rafts. There's no hull underneath or anything like that. And all you're doing is moving the lumber, but the hut is there for the crew and their supplies and food and that sort of thing. And again, steered by that sweep. Now, even in the first photo we looked at, they were using a sweep, but you could also see guys with poles along the gunnels, or what would be gunnels if they had built gunnels, along the sides. So I think whatever type of craft you were using, you wound up poling to some extent anyway. Usually they only cruised by day and worked into an eddy for the night. And Frank van Valkenburg describes on the one trip he took being passed by multiple rafts while they were hung up on a shoal. They had to go during the freshets. Supposedly raftsmen could make it to Baltimore in 5 days. And I suspect that some trips took longer than 5 days, but I guess you could make it to Baltimore in 5 days. And the raftsmen received $5 a day. So with 3 trips, a raftsman could amass cash to buy his own land. And it's also reported that pilot Matt Paul of Corning knew the river so well that he never needed to tie up at night. He could just continue to run 24 hours a day. Dave Van Valkenburg had ridden to Baltimore on one of these lumber rafts. Of course, then they sold out down there. He decided, though, that he wanted to see George Washington's home, so he walked from Baltimore to Mount Vernon and did that. And then he walked back to Prattsburg by way of New York City. And Frank says it was the custom of all the rafters to walk home, but not by that route. And Mcmaster said in 1853, the boisterous raftmen in modern day build their fleet in the eddies of that quiet stream of the Canisteo. So it was still very active at that time. By the 1840s, when the rafts were waiting for high water, it was said that a man could walk from Hornell to Addison without getting his feet wet. And at Corning, the bend in the river forms a harbor where the Post Creek comes in. Rafts would congregate there until the water rose, usually in April, sometimes again in June, and sometimes again in the fall. William R. Smith was a merchant in Addison during the days when very few people dealt in cash. We were not yet a fully monetized society, and especially out in a place like ours. He took most of his payments in produce, most notably millions of shingles. These shingles were 28 inches long and packed in round bunches, and in the spring sent on raft to Baltimore, where they were turned into cash. William M. Stewart says that rafting reached its peak from 1840 to 1855, and that even in the 1920s you could speak to old men who liked to tell of the romantic age when they went down the river on a raft. It was the only romance that many residents of the valley ever had, and its thrills long remained in their memory. Stewart goes on to say that the majority of the raftsmen only went as far as Columbia and were paid off there. They could then take the train to Harrisburg and then begin their long walk home, spending the nights in taverns with, as Mr. Stewart says, a roaring fireplace, others like themselves, amorous adventures with barmaids, an occasional poker game. True, fights often occurred. Sometimes they were rolled and lost their money. Perhaps card shoppers plucked them. But they had their romance in sufficient quantities to last them a year, and they never ceased to talk about it. It was their fling at traveling in far countries, for the land of the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch really seemed a foreign realm. The pay was fairly good. What if they seldom brought much of it home? They had memories. And if we can see the next picture, from 1851 onward, this is the movement of commerce for our region. And though it follows the general route of the river, it's just no longer river traffic. It's rail traffic at this point. The Erie Railroad main line was completed in 1851 from Dunkirk on Lake Erie to Hoboken in the port of New York. And just a few years after that, the Rochester branch branched off at Painted Post and ran up to Rochester. So the Erie's now picking up Corning, Painted Post, Addison, Arkport, Canisteo, Almond, and on this branch, it's getting Cooper's Plains, Campbell, Savona, Bath, Conono, Wayland, Cohocton, Dansville, and on and on and on. Steuben County has 2 cities and 14 incorporated villages. Every one of those except Hammondsport is on the Erie Railroad. So that tells us something about the significance of the railroad. Now, the other means of traffic are still there. People are still rafting lumber down. The canals are still in use, at least for a while. In 1868, the Brooklyn Flint Glass Works relocates to Corning because of its rail connections, but they ship the factory equipment out here by canal boat. But not too long after that, the feeder canals will be closed. And then if we can get another picture here, 1996 for the Steuben County Bicentennial, Dick Shearer, Dick Falvey, John Ormsby, Bill Garrison, and others spent $1,000 building a 4-ton, 28-foot, 1/3 sized ark with plans to drift it down to Baltimore. Now, you can see perhaps the name Joel Pratt on the side here, named for the early prominent Prattsburger who was very big, as we heard just earlier, in the shipping. However, they couldn't agree on a name, so if you could see the other side of the prow, there would be a similar plate there that says Steuben. I'm sure that volunteers here at the Boating Museum never disagree like that. But it's the Ark Steuben or the Ark Joel Pratt, depending on what you like or which side you're standing on. They launched from Corning, ran aground 20 minutes later. They soon decided that, 1, they should have soaked the ark in Lake Salubria for 2 weeks rather than just 2 days. 2, they should have gone about 2 weeks earlier than they did when the water was higher. And 3, instead of Baltimore, which would require working down the shoreline of saltwater Chesapeake Bay, they would settle for Havre de Grace. On the second day, they got grounded at Elmira and had to be trucked down to Wysocks or Wisocks, whatever. How's that? Well, whichever. They had to be trucked for a while and then put back into the river. Their cell phones did not work well. This is 1996 we're talking about. So the support crew frequently had to find a place they could get close to the river and then look for them, search for them, and try to find them so that they could connect at some point for the evening. They delighted people all along the way, except at Port Deposit, where the mayor considered them an eyesore and wanted them out, out, out as fast as possible. But when they left with the morning tide, they took on board 83-year-old Nancy Roberts, the Port Deposit city historian, for the final leg. She had always wished that she could have ridden on a river ark. And she said, "It not only made my day, but my entire life." And in Havre de Grace, according to Dick Peer, the crew was greeted like royalty. And to conclude, we quote the words of Clark Bell at the 1893 centennial celebration in Bath. "To run the rivers on the freshets was the universal ambition of all the younger men for the first half of the present century in Steuben." So that's the story. It didn't last real long, 30 years max, but without it, there wouldn't have been anything going on out here as far as commerce. There wouldn't have been much population, and there wouldn't have been much prosperity, that's for sure. And that's the reason that Charles Williamson picked Bath to be the center of his operation, which ran all the way up to Lake Ontario, was because that was the head of navigation there, or would become the head of navigation on the Conhoton River. Gary.
I wonder if you can either confirm or not something someone told me recently. You talked about the man who came home after he brought his I don't remember whether it was an ark or a raft down and ended up going by New York City.
Yeah.
But I assume most of them came up through Harrisburg and up that way.
Yeah.
And I was told that the first ones that did that actually cut their way through the woods and formed what is now Route 17.
I don't know that. Certainly those roads were being created during that time. People were being paid to do that job. So it was not just haphazard, but they had actually laid out where they wanted the roads and were hiring crews and men and bosses to do it, and surveyors and all that kind of thing.
It's possible that men who went down on the arks or whatever may have hired on.
Yeah, that's another possibility. Yeah, they might have just kind of worked their way back, so to speak. There wasn't a lot by way of steady work right here.
Right.
I mean, farming is always steady work, or at least it's never-ending work. But as far as getting a job, there wasn't a lot. If you were a lawyer or something, Bath was the county seat, and even that wouldn't keep you busy all around. When they had court in Bath, a week of court would completely wipe out all the food supplies. And they would send slaves, usually, riding around the countryside buying whatever they could get at whatever prices the farmers would charge for it. So this was pretty rustic back in those days. Yeah, somebody was over here? Yeah.
That boat that's right behind you, was that kept dry with tar? Or
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nor do I know where it is right now. It was over in front of Dick Shear's barn for a long time, and then I was told it was in the county barn, and somebody recently told me it's in a maritime museum down in Maryland, but if so, I couldn't find it online. So where it is, I don't know. Maybe somebody sold it for lumber, I don't know. Somebody back here? Yes.
Did they go over Sheboygan Dam in that thing?
I can't answer that question for you, but I would say they were not tremendously adventurous on little things. I mean, the whole thing was adventurous, but I think they were fairly cautious. These were guys of a certain age, let's recollect. I mean, Dick Balvey jumped out of an airplane in 1944 and started shooting people. But I think by this stage of the game, he's probably taking it a little slower and was entitled to at that point.
What year was this?
1996, the bicentennial year for Steuben County. Bath was settled and started and founded in 1793, but the county was erected in 1796.
How long did it take them to build it?
It's 1,000 hours, 1,000 man-hours, I guess. What space of time they did that in, I don't know.
Did they ever have livestock or horses to try to pull along these sandbars and stuff?
I've never heard of them doing that. Certainly they shipped cattle that way, and cattle and or oxen, specialized type of cattle. So I suppose they could have done that if they were doing that kind of thing. I also imagine, just like in the early days of automobiles, there were certain places where there was somebody waiting with a team to negotiate the price of his help out of this spot that you've unfortunately gotten yourself into.
Big tree, we think of it
Geneseo, right.
Well, we were in Geneseo Tuesday, and you mentioned Mr. Wadsworth.
Yeah, the Wadsworths are still there.
That house is now open. A descendant, Will Wadsworth, William whatever, he has people in and explains about family, how they made money, and apparently they were pretty entrepreneurial.
Oh yeah, they were. I was just reading up, checking, okay, which Wadsworth is this, because so many of them, I want to make sure I got the right name down. And William there, and his brother James, it said by 1799 or so, they were really rich according to any standard. And some aristocratic guy came out from France, with a team of a pack of hunting dogs and all that kind of thing. And they were living in a filthy one-room cabin, and the housekeeper reamed out the French guy because one of their dogs killed one of her chickens. And he just stayed overnight and cleared out as fast as possible after that. Not too long after that, they started building nice houses for themselves. Maybe it's kind of a wake-up call.
Boston relatives came out.
Yeah.
Connecticut relatives came out. They stepped it up quite a bit.
So when did Hornellsville change its name to Arkport, or around what time?
The town of Hornellsville encompassed today's Hornellsville, today's Hartsville, the city of Hornell, and parts of other surrounding towns. Arkport is an incorporated village within the town of Hornellsville. So the town is Hornellsville, Arkport is a village, just as Hammondsport is an incorporated village within the town of Urbana, or Penyan is an incorporated village within the town of Milo. So Arkport, I guess the name was used at a pretty early stage for obvious reasons. That was the head of navigation there, just as Bath was on the Conhockton.
So there must be buildings in Baltimore made of these boards.
Could well be, yeah. Yes.
Going back to your earlier history discussion, obviously the Arks were a long-way trip, but you made some comment about there were other watercraft that were trying to go northbound. Was there any research, anything about the animal power with ropes and what we used to refer to the term as tow paths, that the animals use parallel to the water?
No, I have not heard of that along this route. I think I remember that an early vessel on Keuka Lake was animal powered, and it ferried east-west across the lake from Gibson over to Grove Springs or Keuka Village, I suppose. I think I remember that correctly. But I have not heard of tow pathing along this route. That's not to say it's not the case. And also, I really concentrated on the New York end of things. And most of the route is farther on, but I concentrated on what's of most interest to us. Certainly, canals were big, booming. You had to have a canal if you planned to be a big town. Now, the reality was, most of those canals didn't really contribute much. You know, one of the great things about the Erie Canal is it connects two places that have to be connected. And people thought, well, the thing is a canal. No, it's not the canal. It's connecting two places that need to be connected. A lot of canals didn't really join anything worthwhile, and things didn't boom. I mean, there was repeated schemes to build major airports down here in Pleasant Valley. But first of all, it's a lousy place to fly in and out of. And secondly, why do you need a major airport here in Pleasant Valley? There isn't any call for it. But the assumption was, well, if we build it, you know, then great things will happen. Only if somebody wants to fly there in the first place. Only if a lot of people want to fly there in the first place. So a lot of the canals really were, in a lot of ways, a waste. Certainly somebody benefited from them, but they weren't the big boom people thought they were going to be. Certainly, you know, you got the Lehigh Valley Canal, the Erie Canal, the Delaware and Hudson Canal. You got some that are very significant, but just building a canal wasn't enough to turn your town into a metropolis. Plus, the railroads were coming in very fast on the heels of the canal. I mean, in some ways, the Erie Canal became obsolete within about 10 years of its opening. Now, you still could, at that stage, move more on the canal than you could on the railroad, but come back 20 years after that, and that wasn't the case anymore. Now, of course, we still use the canal here in New York State. Still important to us, but not as it once was. But without that, New York would not have become New York. Neither the state nor the city. That's what made us the big boom area, and that's what turned New York City into New York City. A great metropolis of the United States, really. Anybody else? Okay, thank you all. If anybody's got any questions, I'll hang around for a while, but if you want to go home and get out of the rain, do that. Thank you. And thanks for being